The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth through Meridian National Park, a fragrance Elias Thorne usually found restorative. Today, however, it felt thin, failing to mask the familiar ache of memory that clung to him like the persistent mountain mist. For 12 years, Elias had been a senior ranger here, his life measured by seasons, trail reports, and the quiet companionship of Shadow, his aging Newfoundland search and rescue dog. Shadow, a lumbering giant of black fur and soulful brown eyes, possessed an intuition that often bordered on the uncanny, a sixth sense Elias had learned to trust implicitly, sometimes more than his own judgment. Meridian wasn't just Elias's workplace, it was a repository of his ghosts. The jagged peaks held the echo of laughter shared with Marcus Vance, his former partner, and the deep ravines held the silence that had followed Marcus's fatal fall during the controversial and swiftly buried Meridian Geological Survey a decade ago. Officially, it was a tragic climbing accident. Unofficially, Elias carried the leaden weight of questions he'd never been allowed to ask, questions that festered beneath the surface of his carefully curated solitude. The late September afternoon was fading, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Elias was preparing to lock the gates at the remote Whisper Creek trailhead, a seldom used entry point deep within the park's western boundary. Shadow, usually placid as they closed up, was agitated. He stood near the edge of the tree line, massive head raised, a low, guttural rumble vibrating in his chest. It wasn't the sharp bark of alarm he used for bears or the eager whine for lost hikers. This was different, a deep, resonant unease. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, hand resting on Shadow's thick ruff. "What is it?" Then he saw her. A young woman emerged from the dense thicket of ferns and firs, moving with a hesitant, almost dazed slowness. She was woefully unprepared for the rugged terrain and the rapidly dropping temperature. Thin jeans, a light jacket inadequate against the mountain chill, and worn sneakers spoke of someone who hadn't planned to be here, or at least hadn't understood where here truly was. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, tendrils escaping around a pale, strikingly featured face dominated by large, searching eyes the color of moss agate. She clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest as if it were a shield. Shadow didn't bark, didn't lunge. He simply stared, his low growl softening into a confused whine, his body tense but not aggressive. It was the same unnerving focus he sometimes exhibited before an earthquake tremor or when sensing a hidden injury in a rescued hiker. "Ma'am, park's closing," Elias called out, his voice carrying the practiced calm of his profession. "Are you all right? You seem a bit lost." The woman flinched at his voice, her eyes darting towards Shadow, then back to Elias. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, not fear, exactly, but a jolt of recognition, quickly masked. I think so," she stammered, her voice thin. "I was looking for something. A place my grandfather mentioned." She took another step onto the gravel path, swayed suddenly, and put a hand to her temple. Before Elias could react, her knees buckled. She didn't collapse dramatically like in the movies, but crumpled softly, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The leather satchel fell from her grasp, spilling its contents onto the dusty ground, a small, tarnished silver locket, a folded, brittle map fragment covered in strange symbols, and a small, curiously heavy metallic cylinder cracked along one side. Elias was beside her in an instant, his ranger training kicking in. "Radio dispatch," he spoke into his shoulder mic. "Medical assistance needed at Whisper Creek trailhead. Female, early 20s, conscious but disoriented, possible dehydration or exhaustion." Shadow nudged the woman's hand gently with his wet nose, emitting that low, worried whine again. As Elias checked her pulse, rapid but steady, his gaze fell on the spilled map fragment. The symbols weren't standard cartography. They were angular, almost runic, and one of them sparked a jolt of unwelcome memory. It was identical to a marking he'd seen on Marcus Vance's personal field notes that had mysteriously vanished after the accident. He carefully scooped up the items, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of the cylinder. It felt strangely dense, not like any standard equipment he recognized. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They focused on Elias, then on Shadow, who sat beside her like a furry four-legged sentinel. "He knows," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her gaze fixed on the dog. "He remembers the frequency." Elias frowned. "Frequency? Ma'am, I think you need rest. Help is on the way." She shook her head weakly, her eyes clearing slightly, locking onto his. "My name is Lena Petrover. My grandfather, Anatoly Petrover. He worked here. Years ago, he said if anything ever happened to him, I needed to bring this." She gestured towards the cylinder Elias held, to Meridian, to the heart of it. He said someone would understand. Someone who remembered the survey, the Meridian Geological Survey. The name hit Elias like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. That project, run by the powerful but shadowy Meridian Geospatial Corporation, had been shut down abruptly, records sealed, personnel reassigned or silenced. Marcus had been obsessed with it, muttering about anomalies, discrepancies, cover-ups. And Anatoly Petrover, Elias vaguely recalled the name. A quiet, intense geologist who had been part of the survey team, one who had left abruptly weeks before Marcus's death. Lena's eyes held his, a desperate plea mixed with an unnerving certainty. "He said the mountain remembers," she whispered. "And so do the Guardians." She looked pointedly at Shadow, then back at Elias. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the evening calm. Elias pocketed the strange cylinder and the map fragment, a cold dread settling in his gut. This woman, Lena Petrover, wasn't just lost. She was a message delivered from a buried past, carrying something volatile, something people had clearly died to protect or conceal. And Shadow, his loyal, intuitive companion, had recognized not just her, but the echo of what she carried, the frequency. As the paramedics loaded Lena onto a stretcher, her eyes found Elias's one last time. There was fear there now, stark and raw, but also a flicker of determination. It was the look of someone who had finally reached a destination they hadn't chosen but couldn't turn back from. Elias felt an old, familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the burden of knowledge, the weight of protection. He hadn't been able to save Marcus. Maybe, just maybe, he could help Lena navigate the treacherous terrain of the past her grandfather had sent her into. He glanced down at Shadow, who nudged his hand, a silent affirmation. The quiet life Elias had built was over. The echoes of Meridian were starting to resonate, and they were louder than ever. Back in his small ranger cabin, under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp, Elias examined the objects Lena had carried. The silver locket contained a faded photograph of a younger Lena with an older man, presumably Anatoly Petrover, standing before the familiar granite face of Meridian Peak. The map fragment was brittle, the ink faded, but the strange symbols starkly clear. One symbol, a triangle bisected by a jagged line, matched the one Elias remembered from Marcus's notes. He'd dismissed it then as a personal shorthand. Now, it felt like a key. The metallic cylinder was the biggest mystery. It was about 3 inches long, cool to the touch despite the warmth of the cabin. A fine crack ran down its side, revealing glimpses of tightly packed wires or filaments within. It felt like technology, but old, almost anachronistic. He tried accessing park archives for information on Anatoly Petrover and the Meridian Survey, but the digital records were suspiciously sparse. Project summaries were redacted, personnel files locked, and any geological data from that specific period returned error messages. It was as if someone had systematically scrubbed the past clean. He needed answers beyond official channels. There was only one person eccentric and knowledgeable enough to potentially shed light on Meridian's buried history. Sealers Croft, a retired park geologist who lived off-grid in a cabin deeper in the mountains, a man who collected park lore and conspiracy theories like others collected stamps. Sealers had mentored Elias, and briefly Marcus, years ago, but had grown disillusioned and retreated after the survey was shut down, muttering about corporate wolves in conservationist clothing. The next morning, Elias drove the winding dirt road towards Sealers' cabin, Shadow riding shotgun, his massive head resting on the doorframe, eyes scanning the trees. The hospital had called. Lena was stable but asking for him. He'd stalled, needing information before walking back into whatever storm she had brought with her. Sealers' cabin was exactly as Elias remembered, cluttered with rocks, maps, books, and smelling faintly of wood smoke and old paper. Sealers himself, wiry and weathered with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, greeted Elias with a grunt. "Thorn, haven't seen you this far up the mountain in years. Trouble find you, or did you finally come looking for it?" Elias didn't waste time. He laid the map fragment and the cylinder on Sealers' crowded table. Meridian Survey. Anatoly Petrover, Marcus Vance. Ring any bells? Silas's sharp eyes narrowed. He picked up the cylinder, turning it over in his gnarled fingers. Petrover's ghost, he murmured. Haven't seen one of these since. Well, since they told us they were all destroyed. What is it? Elias asked, leaning forward. Part of the anomaly detection gear Meridian Geospatial was testing. Sealers explained, his voice low. Supposedly for mapping underground water sources. Bullshit. They were looking for something else. Rare earth minerals, maybe. Unstable fault lines they didn't want public. Petrover thought it was worse. He suspected they'd found something unnatural. Something they buried, literally and figuratively. Sealers tapped the cylinder. These things recorded unique seismic and electromagnetic frequencies. Petrover believed the mountain had its own signature, and that Meridian's drilling had disturbed something ancient, something that reacted. He pointed to the symbol on the map fragment. That was Petrover's mark for a high-frequency zone. Marcus was helping him map them, off-book, before he... Sealers trailed off, his gaze clouding. Before he fell, Elias finished quietly. Fell, Sealers scoffed, or was pushed. Meridian Geospatial has deep pockets and a long reach, Elias. They buried the survey. They buried Petrover's concerns. And they buried Marcus. If Petrover's granddaughter is here now, carrying this, he held up the cylinder. It means the data wasn't destroyed. And Meridian knows it. They won't let that data surface. A cold realization washed over Elias. Lena wasn't just carrying a piece of the past. She was carrying proof of corporate malfeasance, possibly manslaughter, linked to the very ground he patrolled. And the frequency she mentioned, it wasn't psychological, it was geological, technological. Shadow's reaction. Had the dog somehow sensed the device, or the energy it represented? As Elias drove back towards town, his mind racing, a black SUV with heavily tinted windows passed him going the other way, heading deeper into the park. It wasn't a standard visitor vehicle, nor did it bear any official park insignia. He caught a glimpse of the driver, sharp suit, earpiece, a professional, not a tourist, not a ranger. They were already here. Meridian was hunting. He pressed down on the accelerator. He needed to get to Lena before they did. The quiet solitude of the mountains suddenly felt suffocatingly small, the towering trees like bars of a closing cage. Shadow whined softly from the passenger seat, pressing his head against Elias's arm, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they were now both undeniably in. The small county hospital felt sterile and confining after the open air of the park. Elias found Lena sitting up in bed, pale but resolute. A uniformed sheriff's deputy stood outside her door, standard procedure for a Jane Doe found in the park, but Elias suspected his presence wouldn't deter Meridian for long. They were here, Lena said the moment Elias entered, her voice hushed. Two men, claimed to be from the company my grandfather consulted for. Asked about his research, about any legacy materials he might have left me. They knew his name. They knew about the survey. Elias's blood ran. Colonel, did you tell them anything? No? I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, she replied, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. But they didn't believe me. Their eyes, they were like chips of ice. They said they'd be back. She looked at Elias, her moss-agate eyes wide with dawning horror. This cylinder, it's not just data, is it? It's dangerous. It's proof, Elias confirmed grimly. Proof of whatever Meridian Geospatial was covering up. Sealers Croft, a geologist who knew your grandfather, thinks they might have caused instabilities, or found something they shouldn't have, maybe even connected to Marcus Vance's death. My partner. The admission hung heavy in the air. Lena absorbed this, her expression shifting from fear to a kind of grim understanding. My grandfather always said Meridian treated the earth like a vault to be plundered, not a living thing to be respected. He said they woke something up in the mountain. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed hospital robe and pulled out the small silver locket. She opened it, revealing not just the photo, but a tiny, almost invisible inscription on the inside rim. Lat. 44, 131. Long. -121, 811. Listen. Coordinates. Deep within Meridian National Park. Near the base of the main peak, in a notoriously unstable and restricted zone. Listen. Elias echoed Silas's words about frequencies. We need to get you out of here, Elias said decisively. Now? Before they come back with more than questions. Getting Leaner discharged required navigating hospital bureaucracy and placating the deputy with a vague story about relocating her to park housing for observation. As they walked towards Elias's truck, Shadow, who Elias had left waiting patiently outside, let out a sharp, warning bark. The same black SUV Elias had seen earlier was parked across the street, engine idling. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, watching them intently. There was no time for subtlety. "Get in," Elias urged Leaner, practically pushing her into the passenger seat while Shadow scrambled into the back. He peeled out of the hospital parking lot, tires squealing, the black SUV immediately pulling out behind them. "They're following us," Leaner breathed, glancing in the side mirror. "Expected that," Elias muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew these mountain roads better than anyone. He took a sharp turn onto a secondary road, then another onto a barely marked logging trail. The SUV, less nimble on the rough terrain, fell back slightly but didn't give up. "Where are we going?" Leaner asked, clutching the dashboard. "Somewhere they won't expect," Elias replied, navigating a series of switchbacks that climbed steeply. "The coordinates from your locket. If your grandfather wanted you to listen there, maybe there's something more than just a location." He glanced at the cylinder lying on the seat between them. "Maybe that spot activates this thing or reveals what it truly recorded." They reached a point where the logging trail became impassable by vehicle. Thick forest pressed in on all sides. "We go on foot from here," Elias said, grabbing a pack with emergency supplies and his service weapon. "Stay close, Shadow. Lead." The Newfoundland bounded ahead, nose to the ground. Navigating the dense undergrowth with practiced ease, they moved quickly, the sounds of the pursuing vehicle fading behind them, replaced by the whispering wind and the pounding of their own hearts. The coordinates led them towards a narrow, sheer-walled canyon known locally as the Scar, a place notorious for rockfalls and unpredictable weather, largely off-limits even to experienced hikers. As they approached the entrance to the canyon, the air grew colder, and a low hum almost below the threshold of hearing seemed to emanate from the rocks themselves. Shadow whined, pressing close to Leaner's side. Elias felt the hair on his arms stand on end. "Do you feel that?" Leaner whispered, her hand instinctively going to the cylinder Elias had given her to hold. Elias nodded grimly. The frequency. They entered the canyon. Towering rock walls rose on either side, etched with strange geological patterns. The humming grew stronger, resonating in their bones. At the heart of the canyon, exactly where the coordinates pointed, stood a weathered stone spire, unnaturally smooth, almost sculpted. At its base, half buried in scree, was a small, metal plate bearing the familiar Meridian geospatial logo and the jagged triangle symbol from the map. Leaner approached the spire, the cylinder held out before her. As she drew closer, the device began to vibrate faintly in her hand. The crack along its side glowed with a soft, pale blue light. "What's happening?" Elias breathed, hand on his weapon, scanning the canyon rim above. Suddenly, the humming intensified, coalescing into a low, resonant tone. The ground beneath their feet vibrated. Shadow barked, a deep, echoing sound that seemed to harmonize with the tone. Leaner gasped as the cylinder grew warmer, the blue light pulsing faster. And then, projected onto the smooth face of the stone spire, shimmering like a heat haze, an image began to form. It wasn't a video, but lines of data, geological scans layered with electromagnetic readings, shifting and resolving. It showed the mountain's interior, revealing vast, unnatural caverns beneath the surface, and a dense, pulsating energy signature emanating from deep within the anomaly Meridian had found. Interspersed with the data were fragmented log entries, unstable energy source, containment protocols failing, Petrover's warnings ignored, geological integrity compromised. MV, descent silenced. Marcus Vance, silenced. The truth hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just fallen. He'd discovered this, tried to expose it, and Meridian had silenced him. The survey wasn't just about minerals, it was about containing, or perhaps exploiting, this dangerous energy source they had disturbed. Anatoly Petrover had fled, leaving behind the key for his granddaughter to find, hoping someone would finally listen. Before they could fully process the revelation, a sharp crack echoed from the canyon rim. A spray of rock exploded near Elias's head. Sniper, Elias yelled, shoving Leaner behind the stone spire. They found us. More shots rang out, pinning them down. Shadow barked furiously towards the rim, a defiant roar against the unseen enemy. The projected data flickered, the cylinder in Leaner's hand pulsing erratically. They were trapped between the mountain's secret and the ruthless agents sent to keep it buried. The echoes of Meridian had become a roar, and Elias knew this canyon, the site of Meridian's crime and Marcus's silencing, might become their tomb as well, unless they could somehow turn the mountain's own power against their pursuers. The cylinder pulsed again, not just data, but energy, raw, untamed energy. Leaner looked from the device to Elias, a desperate question in her eyes. Could they wield the secret they had just uncovered? "We can't stay here," Elias shouted over the echoing gunfire. Another shot pinged off the stone spire, dangerously close. "They have the high ground." Leaner clutched the glowing cylinder, her knuckles white. The projected data on the spire flickered violently with each gunshot impact. This thing, it's reacting to the energy in the canyon, but also to them. Elias risked a glance over the edge of the spire. He could see at least 3 figures moving along the canyon rim, professionals taking up tactical positions. They weren't trying to capture, they were trying to eliminate. Sealers said Meridian disturbed something, Elias recalled, his mind racing. An unstable energy source. Maybe we can give them a bigger disturbance than they bargained for. He looked at the cylinder, then at the metal plate at the base of the spire. That plate, it looks like an access point, or a control interface. Leaner seemed to understand immediately, guided by an instinct she couldn't explain, perhaps an echo of her grandfather's knowledge embedded within the device itself. She knelt by the metal plate. There was a small indentation matching the shape of the cylinder's base. "It fits," she breathed. "Leaner, don't." "We don't know what it will do," Elias warned, firing a covering shot towards the rim. "We know what they'll do if we don't try," she countered, her voice tight with desperate resolve. She slotted the cylinder into the indentation. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The humming in the canyon escalated into a deafening roar. The ground didn't just vibrate, it shook. The blue light from the cylinder intensified, shooting a beam directly into the spire, causing the projected data to surge wildly before coalescing into a blinding white light. Cracks snaked up the canyon walls, dislodging rocks that tumbled down into the narrow space. Shadow howled, a primal sound that blended with the mountain's groan. On the rim above, Elias heard shouts of alarm, then screams, cut short by the roar of sliding rock and earth. A huge section of the canyon wall near the sniper's position gave way, cascading downwards in an avalanche of stone and debris. The gunfire ceased abruptly. The blinding light from the spire subsided, the deafening roar fading back to the intense, bone-jarring hum. The cylinder, still slotted into the plate, glowed dimly, its task seemingly complete. The canyon was choked with fresh dust and debris, the sniper's positions obliterated. Whether they were buried or had retreated, they were neutralized, at least for now. "Did we?" Lena whispered, staring wide-eyed at the destruction. "You amplified the instability," Elias breathed, helping her up. "Used Meridian's own mess against them." He pulled the cylinder free. It was warm but no longer pulsing erratically. "We need to move, now, before reinforcements arrive, or this whole canyon decides to come down on us." They scrambled out of the scar, Elias supporting Leaner, Shadow scouting ahead through the dust-choked air. As they cleared the canyon mouth, the low hum faded behind them, leaving an unnerving silence. They didn't stop until they reached the relative safety of the dense forest miles away. Exhausted, they collapsed under the cover of ancient pines as twilight deepened. Elias used his satellite phone, miraculously still functional, to send an encrypted message to sealers, summarizing the events and the data they'd uncovered. Proof secured. Canyon compromised. Meridian active. Need extraction. Leaner huddled beside Shadow, stroking his thick fur, the dog a warm, steady presence in the terrifying aftermath. "My grandfather sent me here knowing this could happen," she murmured, looking at the cylinder now tucked safely in Elias's pack. "He wanted the truth out, no matter the cost. He trusted you to carry it," Elias said, meeting her gaze. The shared danger had forged the bond between them, a connection rooted in the legacy of Marcus and Anatoly, two men who had tried to expose Meridian's secrets. "And we will get it out for them." A reply pinged on the sat phone. "Sealers, extraction point Bravo. Dawn, RV waiting. Bring the ghost." As the first hints of dawn painted the sky, they reached Extraction Point Bravo, a secluded clearing miles from the compromised canyon. A battered recreational vehicle, looking innocuous but likely reinforced, waited under the trees. Sealer's Croft stood by the door, his usual cynical expression softened with relief. "Heard the mountains sing last night?" Sealers grunted as they approached. "Figured you two stirred the pot." He looked at Leaner, then at Elias. "You carry a heavy burden now." "Both of you," Elias nodded. "Some burdens are worth carrying." As they climbed into the RV, leaving Meridian National Park behind them, Elias knew this wasn't the end. Meridian Geospatial wouldn't simply disappear. They had exposed a secret, but the entity behind it was still powerful, still dangerous. The fight had just begun. Leaner looked back at the towering peaks, now shrouded in morning mist. She wasn't just Anatoly Petrover's granddaughter anymore. She was the keeper of his legacy, the voice for the mountain's violated secrets. Elias Thorne wasn't just a ranger haunted by his past, he was a protector who had finally found a way to confront the ghosts that lingered in the ravines. Shadow sighed contentedly, resting his head on Leaner's lap. The frequency he had sensed was quiet now, the immediate danger past. But he remained watchful, sensing, perhaps, the longer echoes still rippling outwards from the heart of Meridian. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, the path ahead, though perilous, seemed clear. They carried the truth, and now they would carry it into the light.